Hey guys, Brian here from Better Chess Training, and in today's video, I share one of my recent tournament games featuring opposite side castling. So I'll talk a little bit about the principles, how to handle those types of games. Okay, I'm going to be talking in general about the topic of opposite side castling. So that's where one side castles, say, king side, and then the opponent castles queen side. And I'm going to use one of my recent tournament games to show you some of the principles behind this and how you should go about uh, winning these type of games. So let's get started here. My opponent is playing the white pieces. I'm playing black. My opponent's rated around 1700. He's a friend of mine. We haven't really played too much against each other in tournaments, but in a way, this was sort of a revenge match for me because the only tournament game that I remember we played together, I had a winning position, but I lost on time, and I was less mature back then. But I remember kind of getting angry that he didn't resign in a losing position. But now I have forgiven him and actually apologize for getting angry with him. Of course, that was about 20 years ago. Anyways, okay, back to the game. Starts out with c4 to English, knight to f6, knight to c3, e6, knight to f3, d5. And after c takes d5, e takes d5, d4, we have transposed into a queen's gambit declined exchange variation. Okay, c6, and my opponent pins the knight with g5. I play bishop to e7, e3, knight b to d7, bishop to d3. Kind of going through these opening moves kind of quickly. They're pretty standard, and also want to focus our time and effort on the middle game. I castle. My opponent plays queen to c2. Rook to e8. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes f6. And there are some lines where bishop takes f6 as well, but knight to f6, otherwise the h7 pawn is lost. And here my opponent castles. Just as a quick note, typically white will castle this way and will work on some type of minority attack with the B pawn, maybe the A pawn. So instead, my opponent castled queenside. And so this brings us to our uh, topic today. Now, typically, when this happens, it ends up being usually some type of race. Basically, white wants to attack black's king, and black wants to attack white's king. And because they're on opposite sides, they can push the pawns on that side because they're not leaving their king undefended since they are on opposite sides of the board. Now, you'll see in the game how I go about working on this, but there are two main things, and fairly obvious, but important to mention. And one is to pursue your attack while also trying to prevent or slow down your opponent's attack. So balancing those two is difficult, and there's sometimes when you have to go totally defensive, depending on how powerful your opponent's attack is, and sometimes, as in this game, your own attack is strong enough that it prevents your opponent from pursuing his own attacking ideas. So let's keep moving with the game, but that's kind of the general idea behind these games. They tended to be the most exciting games because you have this mutual attack as opposed to one side being the attacker and one side being the defender. Okay, so a5, totally in line with the attitude that we want to have when we're playing these types of games. And my opponent sets up with rook d to g1. Um, and you can see his plan. Basically, he wants to push the h pawn and the g pawn and try to break in somewhere over here. Now, I play a move that's typical in these types of openings, but actually tactically it was a little bit of a mistake. I play bishop to e6, and the idea here is to protect the d pawn so that I can push the c pawn and open up this c file. However, and luckily my opponent didn't see it, um, my opponent could have played knight to g5 here, and now we have three attackers on the h7 pawn, as well as my bishop being attacked. So, for example, um, best play would be according to the engine at least, would be to move this bishop, preserve this bishop, and basically lose a pawn here. Of course, I cannot take with the knight because then it is mate in 2. So I end up losing a pawn, and that should give white a decent advantage. But just to show you here, if black blocks this diagonal, then white can take here, and if you wanted to, there's a few long lines where with potential sacrifices here on g6, or white can just pursue this type of attack. So had my opponent seen this, I would have been in a little bit of trouble. However, going back to the game position, my opponent instead plays knight to e5, which is fine as well, maybe planning f4 as well as pursuing the attack with the g and the h pawns. And so I make my move that I intended, which is c5, and now my opponent plays g4, getting ready to attack this knight. Now, I was planning if he plays g5 at some point, I have potential to move it to h5, and then play g6, and then my knight can maybe come back here to g7. So that type of maneuver is fairly common in these types of positions. If you study these opposite side castling positions, you'll see that sometimes as a way to kind of close up the position as well as protect the knight. Okay, so after c5, d4 is played, and I take here on d4. So of course, I'm attacking his knight, so he does not have time to attack mine. He takes back, and here I play g6. And the idea here is to maybe slow down something like f4 and f5, but also going along with that plan I mentioned before with g4 and knight to h5 so that my h7 pawn isn't hanging here. And actually, just as a side note, I played this fairly quickly because when you get used to these patterns and you study enough of these games, unless you see a lot of complications you need to calculate, you have a feel for what you need to play here. Time control here was 45 minutes per side, which is not super short, but nor is it very long. So I had to choose. I figured later in the middle game we would have positions where I'd have to spend more time calculating. Okay, h4 is played, and queen to b6. And this is part of the strategy here, is we want to target our opponent's weaknesses and try to force him to be on the defense. By the way, just to show you here, move like h5 doesn't quite work out because I can play g5 here. So that is why my opponent has to play g5 first to blockade this pawn. Now here, and again, it's very easy when you're using the engine and analyzing, I made the decision to play knight to e4, even though I had mentioned this knight to h5 idea. And the idea here is has a few facets. One is maybe displacing this knight, because you can see here the queen and the king are lined up, and so a rook on the c-file would be very powerful. And then the other one is, if he wants to trade off this bishop, I'm very happy with that, because it is this bishop is one of white's main attacking pieces. So that would take it off the board, and then I don't have to worry as much about sacrifices on g6 and things like that. Let me just show you just a couple lines here. It's fairly extensive with knight to h5. The computer says that this is better, and it gives a couple main lines here. King to b1, getting this king out of the way here, and then I could take this pawn, and then after rook to e1, rook a to c8, the computer gives knight takes g6. So I didn't necessarily see this specific line, but I did see these ideas of these sacrifices on g6, which is why I made this decision to play knight to e4. Now, knight to e4 is not a blunder or anything like that. In fact, the position is winning for black here, and we'll see why. It's basically the idea is that white has several weaknesses here. This king position with the queen here is not very good, and black's attack is going to get there faster. My pieces are in better position to attack. Um, so that is why knight to e4, I think as a concept was good, even if the engines say it wasn't the best move. It was the second best move, and that's good enough for me. And that's one thing too that I guess I want to impart in these types of things. It's more important to understand the logic behind your moves. Obviously, if you could play the best computer move every single time, then you'd probably be playing Magnus Carlsen for the world championship. But since most of us can't, we need to be able to understand our moves. And that's why I played knight to e4, because it's a move that I felt maintained the pressure and objectively gave me a few things that I wanted, which is trading off some of white's attacking pieces. Um, so, anyways, let's keep moving. So, bishop takes, and d takes e4 here. And then queen to d2. A little bit of an odd move. I think he's sensing this danger here along the c file. And I was trying to figure out why he played this move, and that was the main thing that I could see. So there's a little bit of some calculations that had to be done here. Um, if we take with the queen, then a couple of things could be played. I could play actually rook to c8 right away with some ideas maybe of sacrificing here, or just pushing the a pawn to undermine the knight's support. I could also play rook a to d8, of course, attacking this twice. And then I couple lines here. If the rook comes to d1, actually, I could just bring it back to c8. Now, there's a couple other lines here. Instead of queen to d2, white can also play d5, just moving that weakness out of the way. Of course, but I have bishop to f5, which is very strong, although using the engine to help me. So even though I don't always, I say you want to make sure you're thinking on your own, and the engine can be very helpful. Knight to g4 can complicate things with these potential checks here as well. And then finally, I looked at knight takes e5, and this one can get very scary here for white. So naturally, rook a to c8, and the knight has to drop back in order to protect this queen. Of course, if it, say, goes to c5, we can just take it. After this, we have this nice pin on the queen. Going back after knight to c3, we take this pawn, and let's say he goes back here. The computer actually says to play rook to d1 here, but natural move here, protecting the knight, would be knight to f3. Then we have this check here, a double attack on the king and on the knight. And then if this knight retreats, we have this very nice little move here, bishop to f5. Again, if the queen moves, we have very nice rook takes c3, and of course b takes c3. You guys probably recognize Bowden's mate here. Show you a couple lines in just to show you how that works. And the computer says the best move after this is to put the queen on c2, which of course is totally winning. So anyways, you could see here that queen to d2, even though it is an odd-looking move, is better than some of these alternatives. Okay, well, I put some pressure on the pawn here, and white defends it again. And then I bring my rook over here to c8. So you see now all of my pieces are very useful at the moment and are all participating in the attack, while white has actually had to bring over back some of his pieces from the attacking positions in order to defend. And this is really what is ideal. Okay, so my opponent, seeing this danger with the pin, tries to move out of the way, and that's okay. I have another pin here, pinning this knight to the queen. And of course, with the queen now on the b file, this b h2 pawn is potentially pinned. So my opponent moves one more time to a1. And here, did some calculations and realized I want to keep pushing and undermining this pawn structure with a4. I was very pleased to find that move. Now my opponent plays knight takes a4, hoping for bishop takes and knight takes, and where white actually is on top after that exchange. Of course, I saw this and simply played queen to a5. And here you can see that black or white is either going to lose the queen or lose the knight. Of course, if the knight comes back, then we have this bishop takes c3, and white is black with this checkmate threat on h2 is going to win a lot of material. In any case, after queen to a5, queen to e3, giving up the knight, queen takes e3, and here trying to stop the action here with b3. Well, we don't have to do anything fancy here. I just have to keep my queen protected, so I play queen to a3. And here my opponent desperately tries to trade off some pieces, and here played one more very nice move. In fact, I want you to just pause the video, take a moment, and see if you could find what I played next. In fact, maybe you can calculate the winning combination. Okay, hope you had a chance to take a look at the position. The final combination is quite nice, at least in my opinion. And let's take a look here. Now we can see here that taking on c1 doesn't really do too much. After queen takes c1, then white has a chance to at least defend himself for a little while, even though black is up a piece, so it is winning for black. But so I didn't do that. Instead, I played bishop to b3, and I actually saw it's not too hard to calculate out. But the idea here is that mate is threatened here on h2, so black or white has to do something about it. Of course, this queen and this rook are protecting the c1 rook. So basically, this queen is overworked. If it tries to defend with something like queen to e2, then rook takes, let me just show that, I guess. Rook takes c1 check, rook takes c1, queen takes c1 is mate. And of course, rook takes c8 leads to checkmate right away, which is the main threat. So queen takes b3. Now, again, rook takes c1 check, rook takes c1, queen takes c1, and queen to b1 is forced. And hopefully you saw this whole all the way through with a nice bishop to c3 mate finish the game. And that's how the game finished. It was a very pleasing game to play, but really I thought this was a nice illustration of the winning the race in the opposite side castled positions. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. Learning to play these positions can be enjoyable. I've played a lot of these opposite side castling in several of my openings, and part of it is getting the experience over the board, as well as studying master games within the opening structures that you play, so that you can see examples of how the masters do it. And over here, I actually created another video of one of my games where the opposite side castling happened, and you can check that out. Actually, a very nice game. Also from a Queen's Gambit decline, but the way that the game turned out was a lot different. So you might learn some different nuances from checking that video out. Finally, I want to thank my patrons. I really appreciate your support. If you'd like to consider supporting the channel, you can check out my Patreon link down below. Otherwise, I hope you check out this video and have a great day.